Today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Lam Gimel. Okay, today's daf is dedicated by Rabbi Julie Danan in memory of a beloved friend, Rabbi Dr. Sarah Tauber, a brilliant teacher and scholar who will be sorely missed by a wide circle of family, friends, and communities. We're going to start now. I want to go back and review what we saw yesterday. Okay, if you look ahead, you'll see that the daf is quite short today, which is a little deceptive because sometimes when you have a very short page, it's all a printing issue. It's because there's a lot of commentaries on it. There's a lot of different opinions. I'm going to kind of stick with one way of explaining the sugyas, even though you should just know, as I like to say often, there's multiple ways to read. One of the reasons I say this, by the way, is because you might be listening to me. Now, not to say I don't ever make mistakes, but once in a while you might think, oh, you made a mistake. That's not what it says in my commentary, but it doesn't necessarily mean that because sometimes one commentary goes one way, another goes another way. So you might be reading one commentary and I'm going by a different one. That's always the problem with translations or any kind of, a Steinsaltz, Schottenstein. They all have, it's one way of reading it when you read it, right? If you don't read the footnotes, sometimes the footnotes tell you there's other ways of reading it. Sometimes they don't. And it looks like this is the way to read it. Just like if you have a Tanakh, you're reading the Torah and it has it translates a word. The word could be translated in two different ways, but the English has to put it in one word. They can't say this or that. So it's always a bit of a problem, but in any case, like I said, not say I don't ever make mistakes, which sometimes I do, but sometimes there's just different ways of reading it. So now we're going to start back with the Mishnah. I'm going to quickly review the sugya that we did yesterday from the Mishnah. Okay, you can look also on the sheet. I brought some of it in short. So the Mishnah says, if you put this in a tree, okay, I'm going to two new things today. I'm going to start using share screen on the screen with the pictures. So that should help us. The second thing is on the website now, there's a button for the study guide. There's now a button for the pictures. So any day there'll be pictures, there'll be a button with the pictures and you can click on there. So don't look for it where it was before. Okay, so we saw this case of a tree. Okay, so let's put up, I see now 1 second. Okay, wait. I have to get used to using the share screen. No, this is not what I want. Okay, 1 minute. Okay, this didn't work. Let me go back to, I'm on the wrong screen. Okay, here we go. Oh, I got off of it. Okay, does everyone see the pictures now? Do you see is that appearing on your screen? Okay. So we saw this case where you have a tree. Okay, I'm looking at today's pictures because it's too hard to pull up yesterday's and today's, but you have this tree and your Eruv is in the tree. So we have a spot that's lower than 10 and higher than 10. Okay, so we saw if it's higher than 10, then we say the whole issue, the topic of today is going to be accessibility. Soon later, at the end of the daf, we'll get to stability. But first, we're going to start with accessibility. Your Eruv needs to be accessible to you. So if you're here in the public domain, this is, remember, the black is always the public domain. You want your Eruv to be there, but your Eruv is higher than 10 tefachim off the ground, and your tree is 4 by 4 wide. That means, like we've said many times, that if something, and today is going to be an excellent review of what is a Carmelite, what is a Makom P'tur, what is a Rishut Yachid, and what is a Rishut Rabim. Okay, so remember when we did that intro, I said these are going to sound very all over the place. Today we're going to see it very practically, and hopefully it'll make more sense to you. If something is 4 by 4 wide, 10 tefachim tall, it's called Rishut Yachid, private domain. Why is this? This is very obvious. If you're walking in the street and there's a big item blocking your way, that's going to be in your way. You can't use that space because there's a big thing blocking your way. If it's small, then it doesn't really block your way. It's not something that you have to move around. It's just a small pole. But if it's a big, wide 4 by 4, it's not super wide, but it's somewhat wide, it's blocking your way. It's no longer for public use. We call that a private domain. So if your Eruv is above 10 tefachim, then we're going to say that it's in a private domain and you're making your Eruv in a public domain. You are not allowed on Shabbat to move an item from a private to a public domain, and therefore you can't access your Eruv. If you can't access your Eruv, that's what we call hu b'makom achad ve'eruvo b'makom acher. He's in one place, his Eruv is in a different place. If it's less than 10 tefachim, and this is how these rabbis yesterday's daf explained our Mishnah, and then Rav Nachman said, oh, great way you explained it, and then Shmuel also, and then the rabbi said, you really think we explain it this way? And he said, yes, we do explain it this way. I like this is now going to be the way we explain our Mishnah. That the Mishnah must hold like Rebbe, that what? That if it's only, now we just said private, public to public, is forbidden by Torah law. What if it's below 10? Below 10, if something's 4 by 4, now we get into now. Carmelit, we've talked about, is usually a C, a big karpaf. Remember, we learned that karpaf space, a big courtyard that is surrounded, not really a courtyard, but a big space like a football field that's surrounded by walls, but not for the purposes of living, right? Then we're going to call that a carmelit if it's more than a certain size, right? More than Beit Sa'atayim. If we're going to have something that's a street, right? A carmelit can be all sorts of things, something kind of in between public and private. So we're going to say it's a street, but let's say 16, it's not 16 amot wide. So we're going to call that a carmelit. But another definition of a carmelit is this in-between thing where we have something in the public domain. It's 4 by 4 wide, so it's kind of blocking you, but it's not 10 tall. Now, if it's not 10 tall and it is 4 by 4 wide, then it's wide enough to block you, but it's not wide enough to be called a private, it's not tall enough to be called a private domain because it needs walls that are 10 tvachim tall. That's our definition. Therefore, we're going to call it a carmelit because it's this in between. Now, if your Eruv is in a carmelit, comes Rebbe and he says, well, that's actually okay because even though technically speaking, by law, you cannot carry from private from the public domain where you want where you're basically saying, this is where I want to be for Shabbat, and your Eruv, which is in a carmelit, you can't access your Eruv. But since Ben Hashmashot, in twilight, when Shabbat starts, we're going to say that basically, since that time of twilight, which is the time that determines where you are for Shabbat, Rebbe holds we don't have any Durabbanans in that time period. We don't hold by Durabbanans, and this is a Durabbanan. It's forbidden only by rabbinic law to carry from public to carmelit. So therefore, theoretically, you could carry in twilight, and therefore it's an Eruv. That's his opinion. And the rabbis who don't agree with this concept of Ben Hashmashot would disagree with him. But and that's why the Mishnah only holds like Rebbe. That's what these rabbis said. Basically said, number one, right? We're talking about a 4 by 4 wide tree, 10 tvachim tall. If the Eruv is above 10 tvachim, it's in Rishon Yachid. If it's below 10 tvachim, then it's going to be in the carmelit space. And then we're going to say this is basically going to be permitted. That's what we learned until now. Then we said one more thing, which is, and by the way, right, what we're basically doing is limiting the scope of this Mishnah, because it's only if the tree is 4 by 4 wide, right, then it's going to be an issue. Number two, we're saying it's only according to Rebbe's opinion. Number three, we're going to say it's not if you're in the city or even in the outskirts of the city, because when it comes to Eruv Tchumen, and I didn't say this yesterday, but this seems to be based on, we've learned in the past that there's a machloket about whether Eruv Tchumen is d'oraita or d'Rabbanan. Is it by Torah law, Rabbi Akiva says, or is it not by Torah law, with those who disagree with Rabbi Akiva? This must hold that it's only rabbinic in nature, and that's why we can say that even though, and there's also machloka, by the way, I didn't mention this yesterday, about whether the city has to have walls for us to say this, or even if the city doesn't have walls, it's as if the city has walls, and we view it as if the whole city and the outskirts of the city are considered a private domain for this purpose, and there is if they're filled in, and therefore it goes up, and therefore even at a height of 10, it's not a problem, because this whole thing is viewed like a private domain, and therefore one's Eruv can be above 10 tvachim against the Mishnah. It's not against the Mishnah, it's just the Mishnah isn't talking about that case. The Mishnah is only talking about if you do your Eruv in the middle of nowhere. Okay, if you're standing in the middle of nowhere, and then we went farther to say, and that's where we ended. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Misharshi has said, and we'll start here reading inside, second to last line on Lamed Bet Amud Bet. It would have to be also, and that was the picture we just saw, I'll bring it up again, that the tree would have to be jutting out outside your 4 amot, because we also said, and this is going to be very important to today, there's a lot of concepts you have to have in your head today, trying to review them all so that they'll be fresh in your head. But that we said yesterday that Rabbi said, Hanotein eruvo yesh lo 4 amot. What does that mean? I explained this very quickly at the end of class. I want to explain this better. When you're standing and you put your Eruv down in a particular space, so what do we say? If you're in the city, then you have till the outside of the city limits, the Ibura Shel Ir, we start counting from there, right? There's a whole thing, we'll get into this later, from the last house in the city, and then if there's, whatever. We'll get into all the details of all that later. But, so it's not from your house it's counted from, it's from the outskirts of the city. But if you are in the middle of nowhere, then you basically get 2,000 amma. But here Rava says you get a little more than 2,000 amma because you get 4 amot, your 4 cubits of space, plus 2,000 amma from there. We basically view your space as your own personal space. That's your own Rishut Yachid. So therefore, we only start counting, and that's what you see here on the picture in 162. There's a yellow dotted line. That's called your personal space. Because it's your personal space, right? It's right. Every time we talk about this, you think about where we're living now with Corona and distancing between people, right? Everybody has their own space. That's your space. No one should come into your own personal space. So that's your space. Therefore, it's usually where you can put your arms out, basically, right? It's 4 amma. You can put your arms out, right? Because it's half an arm length. So it means like stretch your arms. That's your space. So now, he says, if that's your space, and this whole thing is considered Rishut Yachid then, where the tree is. So if the tree goes straight up and the branches go straight up and they branch out, but they're still within your 4 cubits of space, then even higher than 10 tfachim should be fine. So therefore, it can't be that's what the Mishnah is talking about. He says it must be where the ilan juts out, outside the 4 cubit space, okay? That's what you see in the picture here, but I don't want you to look at this top part yet. Right now, we're assuming it just juts out horizontally, okay? It's a little bit strange that they think this, but it sounds like it's just jutting out horizontally, okay? And then you're outside the space, and that's where you want to put your eruv. But now the Gemara says, wait a minute. If that's the case, and then I stopped kind of mid-sentence yesterday, but which I kind of explained, but I just didn't read it inside. Your intent at that point was to acquire the space, right, next to the trunk, the tree trunk. And here, your tree jutted out more than 4 cubits. So then the height becomes significant. Okay, I just want to review. If you're within a private domain, remember, private domains go up to the heavens. So you still would be, even at a height of above 10 tefachim, you would still be in the same space. So that's why the only way this case could be is if it juts outside your 4 cubits. So then they say, which is a bit of a strange question because you can obviously explain it some other way, but they say, umay lamala, umay lamata. But it says in the Mishnah, if you put it lamala me'asara, it doesn't work. If you put it right above, if you put it below, it works, which sounds like you're standing by the tree and there's 2 possibilities for you. Either put it higher or put it lower. The way we just described it is there's a branch that juts out more than 4 amot. It sounds like it's at one height, and it almost sounds like it's horizontal, right? Because you're going to put your Eruvin, it has to be horizontal. Basically, we're going to say it sounds like there's only one option. It's either above or below. So what do they answer? The hadar zaki. What happened is it jutted out. Now we get to our picture. The branch jutted out and then went up. And then jutted, there was another horizontal branch going on. So you basically have 2 horizontal branches that are both outside your 4 cubit of space. They jut out on the side. There's one space to put one above and there's one space to put one below. And that's what the Mishnah is discussing. Now they say, wait a minute. Okay, move on to picture number 163. Let's assume that that's the case. So your tree juts out at a height of, let's say, below 10 tfachim. And then there's a spot, right, then it starts going up. And then there's another branch that goes horizontally above 10 tfachim. And you want to say that the one that's above 10 tfachim is a problem because that's in, remember, where is that? That's in a private domain because that's higher than 10 tfachim off the ground. That's private domain because, again, the base of your tree is 4 tfachim wide. So that branch is considered part of the private domain. And that's why it's a problem. The part underneath, we're going to say, and Rashi says, it's considered a carmelit, the space underneath. And that's because we said carmelit is under 10, it's going to be a carmelit. So now the Gemara says, "V'ha'i ba'im ma'tela derech alav." Okay, we're going to go with Rashi's interpretation here. He says like this: when you're okay, and here's the person standing here. You can theoretically climb up onto that branch, okay, that's below 10 tefachim. Now, if you climb up onto that branch obviously juts out from the trunk, which means that when you're in that space, and that's why this yellow dotted line is very important. When you stand up on that tree branch, you're actually in a private domain. Then if you walk along the branch, now if you were to walk along the ground and reach up the 10 tefachim to get to your Rishut Yachid, you would say the eruv is not accessible. You're in a public domain. The eruv is in a private domain. That's no good. But if you walk across this branch to get to the eruv, that's above 10 tvachim, you can actually do that halachically. Because if you walk on the branch, you're in the space of a karmelit. And again, if we hold like Rabbi, that we don't care about the Rabbanans, bein hashmashot, then theoretically, bein hashmashot, the Eruv is accessible to you. You could walk derech alav, which literally means through its leaves. Okay, that's why I think they paint the tree like this in the picture, that your head is in the leaves. Okay, it's a little hard to understand why they say in the leaves, it's really through the branch. But either which way, you could say maybe they just use those words interchangeably. And what it means is you walk on this branch and you can actually access your Eruv in that way. So then they say, why not? So they're going to say something interesting, which is, and this came up in Masechet Shabbat, some of this will be good review from Masechet Shabbat. Kisher rabim mechatfim alav uchideula. You would have to say, again, we keep on limiting the Mishnah if you follow, right? We limited it a lot so far. We're limiting it even more now, right? Remember we said already the recent limitations besides the original ones that we said yesterday was, not in the city, not in the outskirts of the city, not in a tree that even if you're out in the middle of nowhere, it can't be a tree where the branches go straight up. It would have to be that they jut out 4 amot. So we're already getting more and more limiting. Now he says it has to be a tree branch that, look at picture number 164, that people remove their bags and put it on. Okay, what does this mean? Remember this? We'll read it inside. Uchideula, as Ula says, Da'amar Ula, Amud Tish'a Bereshut HaRabim, V'Rabim Mechatvin Alav, V'Zarak V'Nach Al Gabav Chayav. You have a pillar in the middle of Reshut HaRabim, a beam that's 10 tvachim high. Let's assume it's 4 tvachim wide. What do we say? That's called, what is it called, right? If it's less than 4 by 4, we're going to call it a makom p'tor. It's an exempt space. You can put something on there if you want. If it's 10 high, then, and 4 wide, 4 by 4 tvachim wide, it's a reshut yachid, and you can't move your object from reshut rabim and put it on top. If it's less than 10 and 4 by 4 wide and higher than 3, because anything less than 3 is attached to the ground, we call it a karmelit. That's what I said earlier in the shiur. That's a karmelit. So if I throw my object, I'm in the public domain, and I throw it onto that pillar, I threw it onto a karmelit. That means I'm not obligated by Torah law, because by Torah law, there's no problem with that. However, okay, what's the issue? In a case where it's 9 tvachim high, which is a good height for people who are carrying heavy bags, right? I'm walking off in the supermarket, I'm carrying heavy bags, and my back is hurting me. What do? I stop for a minute and I put it down. Now, I have 2 options. I could either put it on the ground. That's not so good for my back. If I find something at a particular height, like a ledge, I'm going to put it on that ledge because it's much easier for me to put it down there and pick it back up. So they say if you have an amud that's 9, says Ula, and people use it for putting their bags on, then what happens? Okay, this goes back to, this is why I prefaced today by saying, what happens when you have this beam in the middle of Reshut HaRabim? It blocks your space, it's not usable, and it's a Reshut Yachid, or a karmelit, depending on how high it is. But if it's usable to the public, then what happens? Once it's usable to the public, like here in this picture, people are putting their bags on it, it becomes part of the public domain because it's used by the public. So in that case, this now becomes a Reshut HaRabim. If that's the case, because it's used by the public. So again, it would have to be where it was at a height, where it was usable to the public and people used it. That's the case our Mishnah is talking about, because now this person who climbs up into the tree and wants to walk from his own private space of his own 4 amot, and he has to walk through the public domain to get to his Eruv. That's why the Eruv is problematic. Okay, that's what this picture is showing. So now we're going to say, so I couldn't see the chat before, so now I see it. With the share screen, it's hard to see everything. You can't use a tree. Yafeh, what's the issue? I see already Medina answered. Okay, you can use the tree because, again, we're bein hashmasha. Bein hashmasha, using a tree is only a problem. Maybe you'll pull up a branch. That's derabanan in nature. So therefore, it's rabbinic, and we're not worried about that when Shabbat, right, during this twilight time period. So they've now limited the case to a number of, right, situations. We're going to say it's above 10, right? Well, that was the Mishnah itself, but it's 4 by 4 wide, right? We said it's according to Rebbe, who says that as long as it's accessible bein hashmashot. We said it's outside the city. It's outside the city limits. It's if you're outside all those things and you're in the middle of nowhere, it's still that the tree has to jut out outside your 4 amot, and the tree branch that's lower that you could theoretically climb to get to the higher spot would have to be a branch that people use for putting their bags on, in which case it'll be public, in which case that all comes to explain why if it's higher than 10, it would be a problem. Because you can see that there's many situations where it could be higher than 10, it would actually be okay. It's a very interesting thing that happened here, where we had a very simple looking Mishnah, and the Gemara just couldn't make sense out of it and had to narrow it based on other principles that they knew about. It's common, but it's not so common that you have so many. Now the Gemara goes back to Rebbe and Rabbanan. This whole issue of Ben Hashmashot. Are there Rabbanans and Ben Hashmashot, or are there not? So it's a machloka between Rebbe and Rabbanan, and Rebbe and the rabbis, and they want to know, where does this machloka come up? I want to just point out, I looked up a little bit halacha l'maaseh, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins, as does the Rambam, and the Shulchan Aruch based on the Rambam, says that we hold like Rebbe, that in fact there are shvuts Ben Hashmashot. Okay, now you might say, that's crazy. We all, right, Ben Hashmashot, we treat the same way. The only, right, there's almost nothing that's different Ben Hashmashot in our lives. So this big question as to why. In fact, I looked up and I found a question that was asked to Rav Amital about soldiers. And the question was, on Motzei Shabbat, or toward the end of Shabbat, they would be out guarding somewhere, and the truck always comes to pick them up, and it's always a little bit before Shabbat ends. And they asked, every time we kind of say, can we push off, can we push it off? And it's always a debate. And can we actually go in the truck when they come? And then basically to answer this question, Rav Amital brought up this whole sugya that maybe there's a difference Ben Hashmashot if it's only D'Rabbanan, and basically goes into this whole discussion about, is it okay or not? And what he says is, even though they say it sounds like it's okay from the Shulchan Aruch, basically there's different opinions. Some people say, first of all, he distinguishes that maybe it's only, notice our sugya is only talking about when Shabbat starts, and maybe this principle only applies when Shabbat starts and not when Shabbat ends. That's based on one of the commentaries. Another thing he brings up is that, if you remember we learned in Brachot that there's a whole debate about when is, and also in Masechet Shabbat, when is Ben Hashmashot? Remember Rabbi Yossi says it's keheref ayin, it's like 1 second. And therefore they say we have to be machmir because maybe it's not the definition of Ben Hashmashot that we think. We think twilight is from the time the sun sets until the stars come out. But maybe that's not. And therefore we can't start saying, oh, we can do all the Rabbanans because maybe we're wrong about the time. So he basically says, in their situation, he said, look, if it's a security issue and they don't want you out at that hour or something like that, then obviously you can. But if it's not a security issue and it's just that they're lazy or whatever it is, then you should try your best to make sure not to do it. Very interesting question. Okay, so now, my Rebbe, my Rabbanan. So where do we see that they actually have this machloket? Ditanya. It says in the following Braita, and first it's going to start out exactly like our Mishnah, and then it's going to go more in detail. So far, that's our Mishnah, right? You put it in the tree, higher than 10 tvachim, it's no good. Less than 10 hands breadth, it works. Now we start adding things. This Braita now has more to say. If you remember, by the way, we said they explained it must be Rebbe. Here you're going to see explicitly that it's Rebbe because it's going to say Divrei Rebbe. Ve'asor litlo. And he says, but he adds here, by the way, you can't take your Eruv, because if you went to take your Eruv, what would be the problem? It's on Shabbat, right? It's in a, yes, this works, but you're not allowed to touch your Eruv, right? So because you can't access it because it's Asr Midrabanan, because it's in a Carmelite and you're in a Rishut Rabim. So even though it works, because Ben Hashmashot, theoretically you could get to it, on Shabbat, don't touch your food if you do it in this way. B'toch shlosha, if it's within 3 from the ground, then mutar litzlo, then you can actually take it, because anything within 3 from the ground, it's as if it's in the ground, it's not in a Carmelite, it's in the same Rishut as you are. So then you can even eat your food. Nitano b'kalkila, and this is the case that's going to bother us for most of the daf, or the whole daf actually, from here on. The next case is you put it in a kalkila. Okay, what's this? It's a basket. You have a basket attached to a tree. Okay, maybe the basket was collecting sap, or maybe they used it to collect fruits. I don't know why there was a basket, but assume there's a basket tacked onto the tree. Okay, you see it in picture number 165. It's a tree with a basket attached. Utzla'o be'ilan, you hung it on the tree. Afilu l'mala me'asarat tvachim eruvo eruv divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says this eruv works. If you put it in there, it doesn't matter that it's higher than 10 tvachim. It's fine. So even though normally 10 tvachim is a problem, if you put it on the branch, if it's in this basket that's attached to the tree, it's okay. We're going to have to see why it's okay. We'll get to this later. Now we have a chachamim. Now what we want to figure out is, where do chachamim say that if you can if it's a problem, bein hashmasha, right? Bein hashmasha, you're not allowed to do isurei derabanan. Where do we see this? So chachamim omrim kol makom she'asur litlo ein eruvo eruv. The rabbis say any place where you can't access your eruv doesn't count. But it's not clear, is he talking about the kalkala? Because the kalkala Rebbe said worked, and he's saying the kalkala doesn't work, or is he talking about the early case, about lower than 10? So chachamim omrim ahaya, which is it referring to? Ilema aseifa. If you want to say it's talking about the kalkala, then it would have nothing to do with our topic. Then you would say lema kasave rabbanan. Well, this would be a problem. Why? Then, if that's the case, you would say it's stadim asurim. Why would they forbid the eruv it's in the kalkala? Now, this goes back to a sugya we learned in Masechet Shabbat. Remember the whole sugya with hammocks, where we talked about if you put a peg and the hammock's hanging on the peg, that's what we call sedate stadim. It's already too removed from the tree, right? You can't use a tree, but if you use, can you use the sides of a tree? There was a whole debate. Can you use the sides, or can you use the sides of the sides? Now, in that whole discussion, nobody ever said, when they were trying to figure out who says what, nobody ever said, well, the rabbis say that stadim or asurim. And if they never said that in that whole sugya, then we have to assume that it's not clear from this braita. Otherwise, they would have quoted this braita and said, hey, look, the rabbis forbid the kalkala because it's using the side of the tree, and you can't use the side of the tree. Remember, you can't use something in a tree because you might move the tree. But the idea here is, since it's in something attached to the tree, you're not actually moving the tree when you go to get something in the tree. Or maybe you are, and that's the whole debate. So if the rabbis were referring to that, we'd have a clear-cut answer about what the rabbi's position is. And we don't, because we learned that together and nobody ever said that. So therefore, that can't be what the rabbis are referring to. So therefore, it must be ela aresha. It must be talking about the first part, which basically shows that they say, if you put it lower than 10 tvachim, Rebbe says it's okay, because you can access it during twilight hour, because even though it's in a Carmelite and you're in a Reshut Rabin, that's only forbidden by the rabbis. But the rabbis say, by rabbinic law, not to confuse it with the rabbi's position, that's Rebbe. The rabbis say, no can do. Remember, Rebbe said there, you just can't eat it because you can't access it on Shabbat. But he was okay since you could access it during twilight. Comes the rabbis, and they're basically saying, you can't do that because if you can't access it, then, right, and during twilight, obviously, they think you can't access it, okay? And therefore, it's a problem. Okay. That's where we see the rabbi's opinion. But now we want to deal with this kalkala case. So now the Gemara says, Hi ilan hechidami. What exactly is the case of this tree with the kalkala? Idelepe arba'a, if it doesn't have 4x4 at the bottom. Then what do we call this? Anything that doesn't have 4x4 that's in the middle of Reshut Rabim, I already said, that's called a makom p'tur. It doesn't get in your way at all because it's so narrow. If that's the case, it's a makom p'tur. If it's a makom p'tur, then of course you can access it. There shouldn't be right? There's no issue here. It's obvious. Kalkala, right? It's a makom p'tur and it's allowed entirely. And there wouldn't be a debate about this at all. If it has 4x4 with this tree, okay, it's 4x4, and the kalkala is at a height above 10, well, then what would you say? It's in a private domain, because that would be a problem. So how does it help you to have a kalkala? So the Gemara says, well, I'm a Ravina. Now, if it didn't have, the other question, idelepe arba'a, is really a question on the beginning part of the Mishnah. If it doesn't have 4x4, then it's a makom p'tur, and then in the beginning of the Mishnah where it says, if it's higher than 10, it's a problem because it's in a private domain, well, that would make no sense. It's a makom p'tur, it should be allowed. So in order to answer the question, the Gemara says, I'm a Ravina. This is the first answer to the question. Ravina says, Reisha de'ipe arba'a, Seifa deleipe arba'a. We're talking about two different cases. The tree that we distinguish above 10, below 10, is a tree that has 4x4, and that's why at a height of 10, we're already in a private domain, no can do. But the second part with this kilkala, okay, here, I don't know why they don't show the dimensions here, but they should have shown the dimensions in the picture. In picture 165, we're going to say that the tree has less than 4x4. Now, why is this significant? So we're going to get to this right now. This is going to explain why it's allowed and what Rebbe is trying to teach you by telling you this. Kalkala mashlim tola arba'a. What does that mean? So let's look at picture number 166. If you would measure this space, okay, here they chopped off the top of the tree just so you could see the top. we basically have a pole, let's say, with a kilkala attached to it, and we want to put it in the kalkala, right? If you were to chop off the tree at the top and you combine the top of the kalkala with this basket, with the tree, together you would measure 4 by 4, okay? And then you would say, Rabbi Savarla ki Rabbi Yehuda, ki Rabbi Meir, v'Savarla ki Rabbi Yehuda. Hold off for a minute. We're going to have to read a little bit more in order to understand what they're talking about. Savarla ki Rabbi Meir, da'amar chokekin lahashlim. I hope this sounds familiar. We've seen this a bunch of times. This is good, right? This is, I promised at the beginning when you start learning Shas that, right? We're going to repeat topics all over. So if you don't get them the first or the second or the third, right, you'll get them maybe by the fourth or the fifth. What is chokekin lahashlim? Remember the classic case where you have an arched doorway and the top of the arch is not 4 wide. Are you obligated in mezuzah or not? If the bottom is 4 wide, Rabbi Meir holds against the rabbis, chokekin lahashlim, we view it as if it was rectangular shaped, as if it was a real doorpost. We can imagine as if it's not there, we kind of expand the boundaries. We can view it as if it's full, complete. So that's the same thing he says here. We take this kalkala, even though it doesn't really look like in 166 because it's not cut off at the top. It's attached to the side of a tree. But we view it as if the top of that basket, even though the basket is not 4 by 4 wide, we view it as if the whole top of the basket is 4 by 4 wide. It's if it combines with the width of the tree, and if the combined width gets us to 4, then we're good. Now, good in terms of what? Okay, what does this mean? So we have to explain. Good in terms of, okay, v'savarla ki Rabbi Yehuda, now we're switching. I told you in the beginning that we're mainly talking about accessibility today. But now we're switching to a different topic. Stability is what we need here. This doesn't have to do with accessibility. It has to do with stability. So what does he say? Savarla ki Rabbi Yehuda da'amal be'inan eruv al gabe makom arba'a v'leika. Rabbi Yehuda says you need an eruv to be, if you're putting your eruv at a height, okay, when you put something on the ground, it's very stable. If you're putting something at a height on top of something, it's unstable, right? We always say, oh, don't put it there. It's very precarious. It might fall. So it needs a solid space to rest upon if you want to consider this resting on this item. So Rabbi Yehuda says it has to have makom arba'ah. So what do we say? The leika, this space, this kalkala does not have arba'ah. So if you want to put your eruv on this kalkala, then what do we have to say? Unless it has a space of 4 by 4, and this doesn't, it doesn't work. Comes Rebbe, and what does he say? Well, if you combine Rabbi Yehuda with Rabbi Meir, and we say chokekin lahashlim, then we end up saying that this kalkala is as if you put it on a space of 4 by 4, and it's stable there. It's actually funny because it's not exactly stable because it doesn't really have a space of 4 by 4, right? Because look at the picture. If you look above, right, it's just on the kalkala. And the kalkala, if you look at 165, right, the tree is next to it and you don't have the space. But he says we view things as if they're together, and we view it as if you have a space of 4 by 4. Now, there's one issue here that we have to grapple with, which is what? This space, what do we say? The tree doesn't have 4 by 4, but we say chokekin as if, right? We view it as if the whole, right, as if the kalkala has 4 by 4. And it's a height of above 10 tefachim. Now, if it's a height of above 10 tefachim, why don't we view this as Rishut Yachid? If it's Rishut Yachid, we end up with, we might have stability, but we don't have accessibility because you're in Rishut Rabim and your eruv is up at a height of 10 tefachim. But what does Rashi say to us? Rashi says, look at the second line in Savarla ki Rabbi Meir, the first Rashi on the page. Umiu Rishut Yachid Gemura lo have. This is not called a Rishut Yachid Gemura. Why? De'ein betachtito shel ilam rachav arba'a. Even though we say chokekin, we just say chokekin at the top part where the kalkala is in terms of stability. But still the base of the tree doesn't have 4 by 4. So at this height of 10 tefachim off the ground, you don't have a height of, you just have, you're at a, I'd say it like this, you're at a height of 10 tefachim, you're above 10 tefachim off the ground, but you don't have a base that's 10 tefachim tall, 4 tefachim wide. So this is not a Rishut Yachid halachically, okay? And that's why it's okay because it is accessible because it's not considered a different domain. And because of chokekin, it has this stable spot for you to put the eruv on top of. Now we're going to just read Rabbi Yehuda. Where do we see this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? So the Gemara reads this braita that says, Ditanya. Okay, my Rabbi Yehuda, where do we see Rabbi Yehuda's position? Ditanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Na'atz korah bereshut harabim. If you put up a beam in the middle of reshut harabim, v'hiniach eruvo aleha, gavoa 10 v'rachav 4. So if you put up a beam in the middle of reshut harabim to put your eruv on top of, if it's 10 tefachim tall and 4 tefachim wide, eruvo eruv. V'im lav, ein eruvo eruv. And if not, your eruv is not a good eruv. In other words, if your beam is not 10 tefachim tall and 4 tefachim wide, then it's not an eruv. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. This seems to go against everything we saw today. Remember, height of 10 tefachim is usually reshut yachid. That would be a problem. Lower would be okay. What are we talking about? Adrabu, hu ve'eruvo b'makom achad. If it's less than 10 tefachim off the ground or less than 4 by 4 wide, then he and the eruv should still be in the same place, and that should be totally fine. So therefore, they assume, what does Rabbi Yehuda mean? And this is where we get to. We're trying to get to the stability is the issue. Elahachi ka'amar. Gavoa 10 tzarich sheyehe berosha 4. If it's 10 high, then it needs to have 4 by 4 to stand on. And this is basically his position. Anything under 10, we're not so worried about things falling. It doesn't need such a stable place to sit on. By the way, I'm just reminding you, this 4 tefachim is what we saw also about a mavoi. Remember, there was a debate. Does your minimum mavoi have to be 4 tefachim or 4 amot? Or we saw if you're raising, remember the korah was too high, above 20 amot, and you wanted to raise your floor. We had a whole debate, does the floor have to be 4 tefachim wide? Because 4 tefachim is like a minimum space of significance, right? And we've seen this a whole bunch of times. So basically, he says, if it's less than 10, we don't need stability. It's fine. It's stable no matter what. Once it gets to a height of 10, then you need stability. Now, there's a problem with this line, and I'm just going to put it out there, because he seems to really be disagreeing with what we said before, that if it's 10 high and 4 wide, he says your eruv is good. Now, he's focusing on stability, but what about the fact that it's in reshut yachid and you're in reshut harabim? So what some of the Mefarshim explain is that you'd have to say that what he means is, again, this is reviewing something from the beginning of the page, that it's talking about, imagine the tree or whatever it is, goes straight up and it's within your 4 amot of space. And again, your 4 amot of space we view as a reshut yachid. So if it's at a height of, you wanted to be konesh shvita right next to this beam, and you're within 4 amot of the beam, and the item, that, right, your eruv is within 4 amot of you, then you can go up as high as you want. It doesn't matter above 10 tefachim. 10 tefachim is only once it juts out of your 4 amot of personal space. Okay, that's just a side point, because otherwise this doesn't make any sense. Okay, so now we're going to say, so his whole issue is stability. So again, I want to go back. Where did we start? We had this problem with the kalkala case, and we said, if he's talking about where there's 4, where there isn't 4, right? It must be there isn't, it's not 4 wide, and that's why you can put it up, right? Even if the kalkala is above this height, but it's not a reshut yachid, but the kalkala is mashlim tola 4 for the purposes of stability. That's what he means here, okay? It's for the purposes of stability. It's stable at the top. It's not a reshut yachid, but you need it at least to be 4 tefachim wide, and you don't actually need it to be 4 tefachim wide. You just need it, based on Rabbi Meir, together with the tree, it would be 4 tefachim. We view it as if it's got enough space to be stable. Again, it's very counterintuitive, because at the end, it's really not stable. If the whole issue is stability, in this case, you don't have stability, but you have a semblance of stability. Maybe actually you could say it's leaning on the tree. So maybe it's more stable because it's something, and actually this makes a lot more sense now that I think about it. You're basically, if it's just on a pole randomly in the middle of nowhere, it's not going to be so stable. But if it's attached in a way that it's leaning on the tree, and we're actually going to see now that it's more leaning on the tree and it's not like it's above the tree or something like that, that makes it stable. So now we're going to say, Kiman de lo ki Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda. This whole thing, now again, it's a bit of a debate about who this Kiman is about, okay? And it's interesting, they ask, who is this like? And the answer is, it's not like this opinion, okay? It's kind of funny, because they're asking, who does it hold? And it tells you, well, it's not this opinion. But in any case, they're going to say, who is this hold like? Not like Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. There's a bit of a debate about what we're referring to. Rashi says, what do we mean when we say that we don't view the whole, we don't view, now you could say in this case, and this is what we're going to get to, if you remember, what did we learn? Good achit mechitzta. Remember that? We can imaginarily say these mechitzot go down to the ground. Okay, and this is going to bring us to the next picture. What we clearly don't say here is good achit mechitzta, because if we said that we can view the kalkala walls as if they drop to the ground, then you would end up saying the tree base is 4. If the tree base is 4 by 4 wide, what will happen? You'll be in a private domain and you won't be able to put your Eruv at the top. And this says you can't put your Eruv. So they're going to basically say, this disagrees with Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. And that's picture 167, what he says. What does Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda say? Detanya, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Na'atz kaneh bereshut harabim, v'heniach berosho chaskal. If you put up, now we're not talking about an Eruv in this case, we're talking about carrying on Shabbat. If you put up a beam in the middle of the public domain, and you put a basket on top, v'zarak v'nachal gabav, and you threw something into there from the private domain, from the public domain, you're chayav. Now, normally, if you have something that's not 10 tefachim tall, let's put it this way. If it's 10 tefachim tall and it's 4 by 4 wide, and you throw on top, you basically threw into a private domain. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about here, right? It's not 4 by 4 wide, okay? And you put this traskal at the top. So now they're going to say, why are you chayav here? Because we view it as if good achit mechitzta, the walls of the traskal go down and they create a private domain here. Okay, even though the bottom base is not 4 by 4 wide. That seems to disagree with what we just said about the tree, because we don't view the tree as a rishut yachid, but Rebbe says it's fine to put it there. So he must not hold like Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. But now, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. But now they say no. Afilu tema Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. You could still agree with him, say it does work with him. Why? Hatam hadran mechitzta, hachalo hadran mechitzta. Okay, now I'm going to call it it's like a lamp versus a basketball hoop. Okay, a basketball hoop is like the kilkala case. It hangs off the side. Okay, there you can't say good achit mechitzta because it's just hanging off the side of the beam. But when you have it look like a lampshade, which is 166, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda's case, 167, there it's like a lampshade. Now a lampshade, what's unique about a lampshade, right? There's the base in the middle, and the lampshade is exactly centered on the base. In that case, you could say good achit mechitzta because it surrounds the entire beam. Where it's like a basketball hoop and it's standing off to the side, you can't say, oh, the mechitzah will come down. So therefore, you could say that maybe Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda would agree with our case. It's just he's talking about a different case. The reality of that is different than the reality in this case, and therefore you don't necessarily have to say that. Again, this was all within Ravina. That was Ravina's interpretation of the Kalkala case. We're now going to have a different answer. We had a question and we said, if it doesn't, if it has 4, right, then what does it make a difference if it's in this kalkala? It should be Rishut Yachid. And we said it's not because it doesn't really have 4. The tree base doesn't have 4, just the kalkala does. So then now we're going to have a different answer. Rabbi Yomi Amar, Shane kalkala ho il v'yachol lenatota u'lahaviyah letoch hasara. Picture number 168. Now you have a basket. The basket can be tilted upside down. So assuming the basket is at a height of 10, theoretically you could tilt it downward and from under 10 you can access the food, which means that the food isn't really necessarily only above 10. It could be theoretically, now theoretically is the key word and this is going to lead us to our next question, which is a crazy question. Theoretically, you can access your food because you could tilt it down and it will be within your reshut, and then theoretically, you and your Eruv are in the same reshut, even though you're not really. So comes the big question. So he said this, he taught this, the Rabbi Yirmiyah's answer. And then Rav Shva Rav Papa. He basically asked him the following question. It's funny, someone after class yesterday asked about this. What do you do if there's 2 days, there's a Yantif and a Shabbat? Okay, so let's say, not like Rosh Hashanah this year, which next week is going to come out Shabbat, and then, right, the first day of Rosh Hashanah is Shabbat, the next day is Sunday, but the reverse case. Let's say Friday is the first day of Chag, or any day of one day of Chag, and then you have Shabbat. Okay, so you have Yantif and then Shabbat. So what do you do with your Eruv? You want your Eruv both days. So how do you do it? So the Mishnah explains, Ketzad oseh, what do you do? Molicho b'rishon u'machshich alav. You go on the Thursday evening before Yantif starts, and machshich alav, you make sure your Eruv stays there while it gets dark. Normally then you would leave it because you're done. What's the problem? The problem is that today you want your Eruv to last. Normally you don't care if it lasts. As long as it's there through the time it gets dark, you're fine. But what's going to happen? If you want it to last till Shabbat, an animal could come eat it, a person could come eat it, anything could happen to it. So that's not going to work. So what do? Notes low, you take it. Now it's yantif. Because it's yantif, and that's why it only works in this direction, you can carry that home. There's no issue of carrying on yantif. Ubalo basheni, you go now the second day, meaning the next night, Friday afternoon. Machshi chalav, you put your eruv down, you leave it there. At this point, you can't move it back home, but ochlo, if you want, you can eat it. You don't have to, but you could eat it. Ubalo, and then you can go wherever you want. Okay, that works. Now, this sounds a little bit complicated, they say, right? You have to take your eruv home, put it back. They say, if what you're saying, Rabbi Yirmiyah, is that if theoretically your eruv is in the place it's supposed to be, right? Because it's not. It's really a Rishari Achid up there in the Kalkala. But since theoretically it could be below, so he says, Nema kevandi ibayam tuye matse mematele. Afagavdelo amtie kemanda amtie dami. Why don't you just say, I'm sitting in my house and I'm thinking that I want to be Konesh Shvita and I want to put my food in some random spot. And maybe I could just think about it right here. Now, by the way, some of the Mepharshim say, this isn't a question just for, Rashi says it, this isn't a question just when it's Yantif Shabbat. This is a question for any Eruv. The reason why they brought this was because this is the only explicit Mishnah where it makes it very clear that the Eruv has to physically be there. Okay? So he says, as some other Mepharshim explain differently, but let's stick with, keep it simplified. So basically he says, why do you need to do this? Why don't you just say, I want my Eruv to be there. You have Kavana. We know that Kavana works in all sorts of scenarios. And if what you're saying, Rabbi Yirmiyah, since your Eruv is in Rishari Achid up there in the Kalkala, but since theoretically it can be below, so theoretically I could just say, I want my Eruv to be in some place and you don't actually have to put the food down. Okay, crazy question to ask because that negates everything we've been saying. You put your food down, you have to have Kavana, say this is food for there. But if it's all about what you're thinking and what your intent is, and even if it's not in the same, right, what we're saying is basically this isn't accessible, but theoretically it's accessible. So likewise, you could say theoretically my Eruv could be in that spot. Why doesn't that work? I'm going to leave you with that question and we'll finish this up in the next shiur. Shabbat shalom, everybody.